Okay, so welcome to the Temple of the Silver Stars public webinar. My name is Matthew. I'm an instructor at the Temple of the Silver Star. This is going to be a 12-part series starting today and then meeting at this time every Sunday for the next, for the following 11 weeks, so for 12 weeks total. So kind of a marathon, but I've got some extra time on my hands and maybe other people do too. So I thought this was a nice, way to keep in touch and to do some study. So like I said, there's going to be a 12-part series. Let me see. I guess I'll do a brief overview. So in this first class today, this will be largely an introduction. I'll kind of introduce the idea of correspondences, talk about some of the sort of theory and a little bit of kind of theory and philosophy behind correspondences, and then some sort of historical stuff. And we'll look a little bit about how. So in talking about correspondences, the Hebrew alphabet is going to be our anchor point, the 22 Hebrew letters. That's going to be the place that we're going to kind of branch off into all the other correspondences. And so we'll talk a little bit about, why we use the Hebrew letters, rather than another alphabet or rather than some other system, and a little bit of how the basic correspondences came to be associated with the Hebrew alphabet. And then I rearranged the structure a little bit. Originally, what I was going to do was in the next 11 classes, just talk about 2 letters per class, doing a lot of stuff on the tarot trumps, and just sort of diving into the individual symbolism of the different letters. What I've decided to do instead is for the next 3 classes following this, we're going to talk about groups of letters. So next Sunday, we'll talk about the 3 mother letters. And then in the 3rd week, 2 weeks from now, we'll talk about the 7 double letters attributed to the planets. And then in the 4th class, we'll talk about the 12 single letters attributed to the zodiac signs. And we'll also talk about those 3 groups and about some of their organizational structure. And then in the last 8 classes, then we'll zoom in on the specific symbolism and correspondences of the letters. And we'll probably spend about half of the last 8 classes talking about the tarot trumps. Okay, so let's just jump right into it. So this is the Egyptian god Thoth, or Tahuti, that you're looking at here. Thoth is the god of wisdom and secret knowledge. He's often said in Egyptian cosmology and Egyptian mythology, he was the inventor of writing and also the creator of all human languages. He's also the inventor of the calendar, which of course has deep astrological significance. And it's as the inventor of the calendar that he's associated with the moon, because early calendars would have been lunar calendars. So even though we most typically associate him with the planet Mercury, the Egyptians associate him with the moon for the calendrical reason. But he's not particularly lunar in what he does. He's the divine physician and wields great magical powers. Often magical healing powers in a number of the myths. He's the sort of patron of scribes and of magicians, and is associated with magical writing. How he fits into the cosmology varies somewhat over time and in the different cities. At his cult center at Hermopolis, he's worshipped as the creator god. He's a self-creating god who actually produces the cosmic egg from which everything else is born. So he's sometimes like in Heliopolis, he's more of a kind of scribe and messenger, though he can also be a creator. He's also the record keeper, the observer of everything that happens. He's said to have knowledge of spells, and sort of all funerary spells and all the funerary texts, they all get attributed to Thoth as though he were the author of those. And whether they believed that in a literal sort of way, or whether it was more about the inspiration that when they wrote these spells, they felt that they were writing as the god. There's also a tradition that there are 42 secret books that Thoth authored that contains all knowledge, both sort of hidden and more common knowledge in these 42 books. And then sometimes this myth becomes the sort of myth of a single book called the Book of Thoth that would have contained spells and other secret knowledge. It's mythical, though there are some fragments that claim to be fragments from the Book of Thoth. There's also a number of myths where the Book of Thoth is involved. There's one about an Egyptian magician named Setna, who wants the Book of Thoth so that he can use it to gain all kinds of power and riches, and ends up robbing a tomb to get a copy of it, but is then sort of cursed and suffers this whole series of terrifying hallucinations and things until he returns the book and learns that magic is a divine thing and not to be used for personal benefit. So there's a lot of those types of myths. when sort of Greco-Egyptian synthesis, he gets associated with the Greek god Hermes, with the Roman god Mercury and the planet Mercury. And then he's also in the Hermetica. He's kind of synthesized with Hermes and taken to be an ancient sage, and is the author of things like the Corpus Hermeticum, and is also the reputed author of a lot of astrological, alchemical, and magical texts. So as kind of the god of magic, god of spells, knowledge, and of writing, and of the alphabet, I think he's a great kind of image or sort of patron for what we'll be doing here. Okay, so I want to give you some ways of thinking about what correspondences are and what we mean when we talk about correspondences. There's a huge, kind of vast history of them, and we're not going to have time to go through all of it. But hopefully I'm going to give you a little bit of a kind of survey of the way that people have thought about correspondences, different types of correspondences, and what we mean by that, and what kinds of philosophical, magical sort of implications that might have. Okay, so the French esoteric scholar Antoine Fèvre, he in trying to come up with an academic definition of what esotericism is, or Western esotericism is, he defines some of the essential qualities of esotericism. We're not going to go through all of them, but one of the four essential qualities of what he calls Western esotericism is correspondences. And so I'm going to read, this is from his book, Access to Western Esotericism. I'm going to read what he says about correspondences. So he says, symbolic and real correspondences, there is no room for abstractions here, are said to exist among all parts of the universe, both seen and unseen. And he quotes, as above, so below, from the Emerald Tablet, one of the core Hermetic maxims, right? We find again here the ancient idea of microcosm and macrocosm, or, if preferred, the principle of universal interdependence. These correspondences, considered more or less veiled at first sight, are therefore intended to be read and deciphered. The entire universe is a huge theater of mirrors, an ensemble of hieroglyphs to be decoded. Everything is a sign. Everything conceals and exudes mystery. Every object hides a secret. The principles of non-contradiction and excluded middle, of linear causality, are replaced here by those of included middle and synchronicity. We can distinguish two kinds of correspondences. First, those that exist in nature, seen and unseen, e.g. between the seven metals and the seven planets, between the planets and the parts of the human body or character, or of society. This is the basis of astrology, correspondence between the natural world and the invisible departments of the celestial and supercelestial world, etc. Next, there are correspondences between nature, the cosmos, or even, between nature, the cosmos, and even history and revealed text. Here we find the Kabbalah, whether Jewish or Christian, and we could add, of course, Hermetic Kabbalah as well to that, and various varieties of physica sacra. According to this form of inspired concordism, scripture, the Bible, for example, and nature are in harmony, the knowledge of one aiding in the knowledge of the other. Ultimately, the world stage is a linguistic phenomenon, but neither correspondences nor concordism necessarily means esotericism. Such are found present also in many philosophical or religious currents, where each or more or less delimits the nature of its own network of analogy and similitude. This principle is equally at work in the procedures of divination, poetry, and sorcery, but the latter nonetheless are not synonymous. So he's sort of making a point there at the end that this idea of things corresponding is not necessarily an esoteric doctrine. The author, Antoine Fèvre, that's, I'll type it in. Yeah. And the book is it's actually kind of a collection of works of his. It's called Access to Western Esotericism. It was published by the SUNY University Press. What was I saying? Oh, right. So this is the idea that this understanding of correspondences is not necessarily an esoteric thing, at least not originally. This is a common feature of many traditional societies, and is quite common and openly practiced and openly believed, like in the medieval and the Renaissance worlds. This idea of secret correspondences between different natural forms, between planets, and all this sort of stuff. It's only with kind of the entrance into modernity, like the Reformation, Counter-Reformation, Enlightenment sort of period, that this stuff is rejected and then sort of becomes esoteric, and it becomes rejected in sort of underground knowledge in Western culture. Though it has many esoteric applications and is part of many esoteric traditions, it in itself is not necessarily esoteric. Okay, so a few more kind of concepts around here. That sort of passage does a good job of introducing the basics, but I want to sort of go a little bit deeper. So one of the ideas here is of a great chain of being. The idea that from the highest source down through the various intermediate levels of being, however those are conceived and enumerated, down finally to the material world, which is the sort of lowest point in the cosmologies. In the furthest from the material world, there's a chain of sympathies and a chain of connections. So I'm going to read a passage here from, this is from Michel Foucault's book, The Order of Things, and he spends some time kind of unpacking a pre-modern worldview, and talks, he's most especially talking about kind of Renaissance era stuff, but it's relevant to what we're talking about here. Let's see. So I'm just going to kind of pick up in the middle here. Hopefully you can pick up what he's saying. He says, thus by linking, he's talking about sort of the using resemblance between things as a way of organizing knowledge and organizing a worldview. And he says, thus by this linking of resemblance with space, meaning that the kind of hierarchy of space, the great chain of being, this convivience or the sort of convergence and proximity of things by their resemblance, that brings like things together and makes adjacent things similar. The world is linked together like a chain. At each point of contact, there begins and ends a link that resembles the one before it and the one after it. And from circle to circle, these similitudes continue, holding the extremes apart, God and matter, yet bringing them together in such a way that the will of the Almighty may penetrate into the most unawakened corners. It is this immense, taut, and vibrating chain, this rope of convivience, that Porta evokes in a passage from his Magie Naturelle. Giambattista della Porta was a Renaissance sort of polymath and wrote about natural magic. So there's a passage here from Porta. And he says, as with respect to its vegetation, the plant stands convenient to the brute beast. So through the feeling does the brutish animal to man, who is conformable to the rest of the stars by his intelligence. These links proceed so strictly that they appear as a rope stretched from the first cause as far as the lowest and smallest of things, by a reciprocal and continuous connection, in such wise that the superior virtue, spreading its beams, reaches so far that if we touch one extremity of that cord, it will make tremble and move all the rest. So there's the idea here of everything being linked together, and actually he's using this image of these taut cords that connect everything, and that if you move anything, its vibrations will be passed to everything else. We also have the concept of this is especially important in kind of Greek magical thinking and in theurgy, which we'll talk about a little bit. The idea of sympathia or in philia. Sympathia means like sympathy. The idea that certain things, whether that's on the same plane, like in the material natural world, this can be between parts of the human body and certain plants. And it's also very often between sort of celestial objects like the planets and stars and different plants, gemstones and things like that in the material world, that there's a kind of sympathy and that they have this connection by means of their resemblance. And the Neoplatonists often talk about this as operating through love, that there's an actual kind of love and friendship that unites the gods and their planets with stones and plants and other things here in the natural world. Let's see. Another concept here is the cosmos as a living being. The idea that all things that exist, the entire universe, is a living whole. This includes the material cosmos as well as immaterial things like spirits, intelligences, divine intelligences, gods, and so on. All things are joined together as a single living being. And that there's an animating soul, or it's called the world soul, or the anima mundi, that permeates the universe and that animates it and gives it life and has an intelligence. Also here, the idea that the parts of the world are complementary and interdependent. Everything is connected together in a single web. Another idea here is of universal analogy. the idea that all the levels of the cosmos mirror each other. So now I'm going to grab another quote here from Foucault's book again. Let's see. So he's talking about this. He's calling this idea emulation, but again, it's this idea of reflections, not necessarily connections by like the chains of being, but just the idea that various levels and various parts of reality mirror or emulate other parts of reality. Sometimes mutually, you can have two parts sort of emulating and mirroring each other. So he says, however, emulation does not leave the two reflected figures it has confronted in a merely inert state of opposition. One may be weaker and therefore receptive to the stronger influence of the other, which is thus reflective in his passive mirror. Are not the stars, for example, dominant over the plants of the earth, of which they are the unchanged model, the unalterable form, and over which they have been secretly empowered to pour the whole dynasty of their influences? The dark earth is the mirror of the star-sown sky, but the two rivals are neither of equal value nor of equal dignity in that tournament. The bright colors of the flowers reproduce, without violence, the pure form of the sky. And he quotes a Renaissance author, Crolius, who says, the stars are the matrix of all the plants, and every star in the sky is only the spiritual prefiguration of a plant, such that it represents that plant. And just as each herb or plant is a terrestrial star looking up at the sky, so also each star is a celestial plant in spiritual form, which differs from the terrestrial plants in matter alone. The celestial plants and herbs are turned towards the earth and look directly down upon the plants they have procreated, imbuing them with some particular virtue. So I thought that was a really beautiful way of explaining that. This talk about the stars being celestial plants and plants being like I think I said that wrong. Stars being celestial plants and plants being like terrestrial stars. And these two levels mirroring each other. And that the planets and stars, by virtue of being eternal, are sort of give birth to and procreate the plants here on Earth, which grow and pass away. And so you have this linkage between the eternal and the temporary through sympathy and through reflection. One other thing to note here, and this might be especially interesting when we think about in terms of astrology and things like that, is that these correspondences and various sympathies, sometimes there's a causal sense, like as we just saw, of a higher level, like causing a lower level and that being part of their connection. But this isn't always the case. It varies a lot in different contexts and is often ambiguous. So we don't necessarily need to think about any kind of like causal theory when we're in order for this to work. Okay, so a few other important concepts from kind of staying with the ancient Greek world here for a minute. One is the correspondences between the letters. So going way back, at least as far as the Pythagoreans and probably earlier, there's a tradition of connecting the Greek letters. Now I will show them here. This is the Greek alphabet. You got uppercase at the top and then lowercase at the bottom. The 24 letters of the Greek alphabet. So there's traditions of connecting the letters to gods and also things like planets and elements. The Greek, there's a kind of slightly anachronistically named, but essentially the Greek Kabbalah is a whole amazing and complex world on its own that we're not going to go into, but it's just important to note that all of these basic concepts that become part of Hebrew and later Hermetic Kabbalah all come out of the Greek tradition. See what else I wanted to say about this. Oh, right. Okay. So the way that the letters correspond with especially the planets, elements, and zodiac signs happens in a bunch of different ways. The 7 vowels of the Greek alphabet are almost always attributed to the 7 planets, though exactly which vowel is attributed to which planet varies a lot. There's also 5 of the consonants are attributed to the 5 elements and also to 5 gods and to some other things. They're chosen for kind of a complex reason that we're not going to get into here. And then now you would sort of think that, okay, so you've got 24 letters, 7 vowels attributed to the planets, 5 consonants attributed to the elements. You've got 12 letters left. Those 12 are going to get attributed to the zodiac signs. But we don't see this happening. The zodiac signs get attributed to the letters in a bunch of different ways. One of the most common is attributing the entire alphabet to the zodiac signs, so that there's 24 letters of the alphabet, and so 2 letters get associated with each zodiac sign. There's no evidence that it gets sort of synthesized into a single system where you've got 7 planets, 5 elements, and 12 zodiac signs, all attributed to the alphabet as a single thing, where there's a bunch of different traditions of attributions. Some have theorized that this probably did happen because we'll see that type of thinking in the Hebrew tradition, but that's an assumption. Okay, another thing that's important to know about the Greek tradition, which influences the Hebrew tradition, is that the Greeks don't have separate symbols to use for numbers. And so they start using after having kind of a primitive sort of tally-based system, similar to what the Egyptians and Phoenicians did before them, they start using the letters to represent different values. Now, to represent sort of 1 through 9, and then 10 through 90, and then 100 through 900, you need 27 symbols. And so they add in 3 archaic symbols that were no longer current in the 24-letter alphabet, but they bring them in. One in particular, let me make sure my cursor is. In particular here, you'll see that for the value of 6, that symbol is the digamma. Crowley uses the digamma in some places in formulating, basically for gematria purposes. It looks like a capital F. And so you'll sometimes see like one of his versions of the EIO formula, it kind of looks like it says like FIAOF, like F-I-A-O-F. It's not an F, it's actually a digamma. Crowley uses it as a silent sound, but just side note, something to be aware of. But so this idea of being able to write numbers this way. And so, for example, if you're going to write, I don't remember, I could look that up. It's another one of the kind of archaic letters that was no longer part of their alphabet that had been brought in, but I forget the specific provenance of it. If you're interested in Greek Kabbalah stuff, Kieran Barry's book, it's just called The Greek Kabbalah, is the best source for that. And I'm not an expert in the Greek Kabbalah. But anyways, the concept here was that this way of associating the letters to numbers, and for entirely practical things, there's absolutely nothing esoteric about this. This is just the way that that numbers are written. This ends up getting... oh yeah, I think you're right. I think that is a Sampi. Thank you, Freda. That gets sort of picked up. This is imitated in Hebrew, and Hebrew letters, as we'll talk about, take on values and based on this model of the Greek values. Okay, so I wanted to read the Greek sort of Neoplatonic magical tradition of theurgy is really important for a lot of this development. Theurgy is an extraordinarily complex thing, but I wanted to give you at least some very basic sense of what it is as background. So this is from a book by Jeffrey Cooperman called Living Theurgy. So I'm just going to read a couple of quotes here just to give you a little bit of a sense of what we're talking about and why it's relevant to the topic of correspondences. So he says, the word theurgy, theorgia, is derived from the Greek word theos, God, and ergon, activity or work. Theurgia is ritualized divine activity, God working. On the surface, this may appear to mean the work or activity in which God is engaged. For the pagan Neoplatonists, theurgy is not only the activity of the gods, it is also human activity participating the divine. Theurgy is our engagement in the work of God as far as possible. The word itself is but one of several used by later Neoplatonists to describe the kinds of ritual actions. Other includes sacred rites, initiated mysteries, liturgy, sacred art, divine wisdom, and others, most of which are rendered theurgy by scholars. And then he quotes from Iamblichus, one of the most important theurgists, whose book De Mystere is still an extremely important text, and one of the few surviving of his works. So anyways, this is a quote from him. He says that theurgy presents a double aspect. On the one hand, it is performed by men, and as such observes our natural rank in the universe. But on the other, it controls divine symbols, and in virtue of them is raised up to the union with the higher powers, and directs itself harmoniously in accordance with their dispensation, which enables it quite properly to assume the mantle of the gods. It is in virtue of this distinction, then, that the art both naturally invokes the powers from the universe as superiors, inasmuch as the invoker is a man, and yet, he just means human there, obviously, and yet, on the other hand, gives them orders, since it invests itself, by virtue of the ineffable symbols, with the hieratic role of the gods. Here, I'll type in the author and title if you want. There, Cooper. Okay, so then he goes on to talk about the way that signs and symbols are used in theurgic rites, and this is the kind of important part for what we're talking about here. So Krugman says, the divine symbols the Amblicus writes of are all around us in the generative realm, that is like the what we call the kind of material realm, the created world. They are what makes sacrifice effective. They are the heart of hieratic prayer and theurgic ritual. These symbols are typically referred to as symbols or symbola, signatures or tokens, synthemata or signs. Let's see, he says, these tokens are inherent in the entire physical world as well as our souls, placed there by the demiurge. Theurgy is made possible through recourse to the signs and tokens of the demiurge and gods. So one of the important things here is that there are both sort of natural symbols, physical objects like plants and stones, as well as things like words and symbols, images taken from mythology. These things can all be these sort of symbols or tokens that they're talking about, and that they exist not only outside of us in the world and in the higher worlds, but they also exist inside of our own souls, and that it's that sort of interaction that allows theurgy to be what it is and not to be just sort of common magic, or what they would call goetia. I'll read just a couple more here. He says, all theurgic ritual employs synthemata and symbola. In pagan Neoplatonism, this often involves ritual objects taken from nature, such as the initiatory thrysis, which is a fennel staff tipped with a pine cone dipped with honey, or all tokens of Dionysus. To these natural symbols, Dionysus adds human-made ritual objects derived from scripture. Dionysus, he's talking about the author Dionysus, sees scripture as a kind of divine signature, an idea already found in earlier works. And so anything described in scripture, and by extension the stories of the gods, is potentially a synthema. Let's see. He also says that we find the names of the gods along with their titles functioning as signatures and symbols. So again, the kind of natural symbols that we'd be talking about would be things like stones, plants, animals, things taken from the natural world that would correspond with different gods, with the planets, and with other sort of powers and intelligences. But we're also adding things like titles and names here. And also the theurgic names, what we kind of now call barbarous names. These are divine names coming from the gods themselves, and so are thought to contain their signatures, even though humans don't understand their meanings. Koopman goes on and says, every element of theurgic ritual draws upon divine signatures, signs, or symbols. This allows the theurgist to be raised up to union with the higher powers, and in doing so allows him or her to act harmoniously in accordance with their God's dispensation, and so to assume the mantle of the gods. Without fully engaging in the synthemata, that's the signs and symbols here, the ritual act is at best an act of magic, at worst sorcery, an attempt to play at being God rather than at actually being God. Where theurgy focuses on aligning the will of the theurgist with that of the divine, sorcery attempts to place the goes, the sort of sorcerer, in the center of his or her own system. Instead of raising the rational soul to the divine spheres, the sorcery inflates their irrational soul, and in the end, potentially convincing themselves that they are gods. And so it sort of goes on from there. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of a picture of why these things take on a ritual importance and even a kind of mystical importance for the progression and journey of the soul. And that it's, again, these networks of sympathy, the ideas of the great chain of being that allow this to happen. And the theurgist, by manipulating, both words and natural objects and things inside their souls, they're doing things that they're using the imagination, maybe not exactly like what we would call visualization, but something along those lines, to also manipulate these symbols to produce effects and to raise their souls, up to the highest source. One other important concept from the kind of Greco-Roman world is what's called the Interpretatio Graeca, or Interpretatio Romana. And this is a sort of Roman and Greek attitude towards other cultures and other sort of religions, of using kind of their own pantheons as models for understanding others. And so sometimes when they encounter other cultures, like the Egyptians, for example, they'll say, they call him Thoth, but that's the same god in some sense as what the one that we call Hermes and the Romans call Mercury. That they see between pantheons and between traditions, they see a kind of what we could call a kind of correspondence in a way. That there's something sort of universal, despite the fact that names and images vary, across cultures and across place and things. There is, sort of something there that they're all kind of talking about, and that, that allows, cultural exchange. And the Romans in particular are quite happy to borrow gods from a lot of other traditions and to sort of synthesize gods. They even kind of create some gods based on a sort of synthesis of Greek and Egyptian gods. Serapis is an example. And so this sort of attitude, I think, is important for some of what Crowley and others will later do with correspondences. Okay, we're gonna come back and talk more about Hebrew specifically, but the Sefer Yetzirah comes about in somewhere between like the 3rd and 6th century CE. It's not really clear. And it sort of picks up on a lot of these Greek traditions, but it's bringing them over into a Hebrew context. And again, we'll talk about more about that and about the way it's doing its letter correspondences more specifically. Let's see. So the kind of theurgical tradition ends up or forms of it, anyways, sort of pass into the Arabic world. There's a lot of astrological magic. If you're familiar with things like the Picatrix, this sort of tradition continues on. A lot of this theurgical tradition, where instead of ensouling statues, they're making like talismans for the planets. And obviously some of the language changes under a monotheistic regime. They're not talking about the planets as gods anymore, associating with gods anymore, but they're essentially doing the same thing, just slightly reconceiving them. And then that tradition ends up passing back into the European world in the Renaissance and influencing people like Agrippa, who we'll talk about. Another thing to sort of note, that in the kind of transition between the sort of ancient world and the Renaissance world, and especially the transition between sort of paganism and monotheism, there's a little bit of a reconception of how some of these sympathies and things like that work. Where for the ancient sort of mind, the cosmos was a kind of direct theophany, a sort of direct revelation of the divine. In the Renaissance, they start to see more the idea that like nature is as a garment or as an expression of the divine, but not as directly a revelation of the divine, but a sort of a secondary thing. Another important author here, again, this is a way more complex history than there's any way to go into here, so I'm just going to kind of summarize a few things that I think are helpful. Paracelsus is an extremely important author in the Renaissance. He's an alchemist. I'm sure most of you are vaguely familiar with him. He really developed this ancient idea of signatures. For him, these are at least largely kind of what I was sort of talking about, is like kind of horizontal signatures, especially the resemblances between different plants or different parts of plants and the human body. And so the idea that if the leaf of a certain plant, say looks like a spleen, then it must be good for your spleen or something like that. And using this type of reasoning as the basis for alchemical medicine. Now, he's obviously wrong about a lot of those things, but it is the sort of beginning of the herbalist tradition, or kind of modern incarnation of that tradition, and herbal medicine, and also actually leads to the he's essentially the sort of grandfather, in a sense, of modern Western medicine, though through a series of stages. He doesn't directly create it, obviously. His idea of these signatures really gets picked up by the Rosicrucians, who coming out of that sort of Protestant worldview, see nature. Sometimes they call it the Liber Mundi, the book of the world. That nature is a book that expresses the divine, or that we can read, sort of divine secrets in, which is sort of parallel to the Bible. So you have the two books, the Bible and then the book of nature, and that the book of nature is written in these signatures. So that's big in the Rosicrucian tradition, and obviously influences the Golden Dawn and others. Another important person here is Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, the Renaissance magician, who's one of the most influential magicians in the history, and is important for us to talk about. So I'll explain what this is in a second. In Agrippa's book, Three Books of Occult Philosophy, he includes a lot of correspondences in there, and he doesn't do it in, if you're familiar with 777, he doesn't do it in quite the systematic sort of way that gets done later. He does it in a lot of different ways, and he includes a lot of different types of correspondences. He includes these sort of natural or theurgic correspondences that we've been talking about, especially to astrological things like planets, zodiac signs, other stars as well, these are fixed stars, in addition to the planets and zodiac signs. And they have herbs, stones, magical images, glyphs associated with them. And these can all be used in creating talismans and doing other doing forms of astrological magic. He's also picking up on early Christian Kabbalah and doing a lot of symbolism, or doing a lot of sort of correspondence symbolism with Hebrew letters. Though he doesn't have a kind of full map to the Hebrew alphabet like we'll be talking about here. He does reference the Sefer Yetzirah a little bit, though he seems to get it totally wrong, or is coming out of some very alternate tradition. So we'll just sort of leave that aside. What you're looking at here, this is something called the Magical Calendar. Its authorship is a little bit of a mystery, or sort of complex. But it was published in 1620 and is a presentation on a single page of most of the correspondences coming from Agrippa. So I'll show you some details of it. This is the top third of it here. So this is like I said, this is primarily from Agrippa. This is the middle third of it. Primarily from Agrippa. There's some stuff coming in from the Heptameron and a few other magical works, mostly from Agrippa, although this does leave out all the demons and anything sort of evil, and really just includes just the angels, or anything they would have interpreted as evil. So it's a little bit of a cleaned up version of Agrippa plus some extra stuff. This thing is really interesting in its own right, but we don't really have time to get into it, and it's not directly relevant. But you can see that this sort of taking what is sort of scattered correspondences throughout Agrippa and starting to organize them into tables and starting to arrange them and thinking of them in that way is an influential and important idea. As I was sort of mentioning at the beginning, sort of as the Renaissance is ending, the idea of correspondences is largely rejected in favor of sort of what becomes the scientific materialist worldview. And at that time, when sort of correspondence is rejected, and this is sort of when what we can really call an esoteric tradition really is formed, based on or out of a lot of the things that are rejected by Reformation, Counter-Reformation, and the Enlightenment and the development of the scientific worldview. So a lot of this stuff kind of goes underground and becomes part of secret traditions and esoteric traditions and initiated traditions. So Dee, someone's commenting here that Dee would have been all over this. D would have died before this was published, but there's certainly a lot of this type of stuff in D. I mean, D does a lot of with Kabbalah. There's stuff in his hieroglyphic monad that's very reminiscent. So yeah, D is definitely an important and relevant person here. Yeah. Yeah, right, because D dies in 1608, I think, and this wasn't published until 1620. Yeah. Though I imagine, I don't know this for sure, but I imagine that Dee would have been pretty familiar with Agrippa's work, so would have had access to, and at least was reading a lot of the same, materials that Agrippa would have been. So yeah, definitely part of that tradition. And as we'll see, some of Dee's work, Enochian work and stuff like that ends up becoming part of like the Golden Dawn and Crowley's correspondence systems. Another sort of important figure that we don't really have time to get into, but Emanuel Swedenborg, the 18th century Swiss mystic and writer, he has a kind of new take on correspondences based on older ideas. He sees that this idea of there's like a natural world and a spiritual world, and that everything in the natural world corresponds with the spiritual world, though in a little bit of a different way than people have been talking about it before. But he sees the natural world as essentially something like a language that expresses the spiritual truths if we're able to see it. He also talks about the idea that correspondence is the kind of original divine language that would have been spoken by humans in the Golden Age. And that it's this divine language that at least the early books of the Bible were actually written in. So he takes like Genesis and the other early books of the Bible as not literal histories, but as sort of presentations of this spiritual truth written in the language of correspondence. Let's see. Other sort of important ideas here to talk about. We obviously found a lot of this. There's a kind of geocentric assumption in a lot of those correspondences where, the things sort of down here on Earth correspond with the things like up there in the heavens. But with, the change from the geocentric, cosmology to the heliocentric cosmology, a lot of those ideas start to get overturned, and you see kind of modern reinterpretations of some of the ideas of correspondence. I think Eliphas Levi is really important here. His idea of the astral light, a sort of medium that permeates all things. So whereas the astral, literally means like astral from the word like stars, was the celestial world above the earth, the astral light sort of interpenetrates all things. And so you get these same ideas about universal connection, but happening less in a kind of cosmologically like hierarchical, or not that it isn't hierarchical, but it's less sort of spatialized. Like all the powers are sort of present in all places, rather than being the powers here on Earth corresponding with the powers like up there in the celestial realm. Yeah. Let's see. Andrew had a question here. He's asking: is there an abrupt departure from correspondence with the start of the Reformation and the Enlightenment, or are there signs historically that thought was moving away from correspondence prior to these events? I mean, obviously that's a really complicated historical question. I'm probably not the best person to answer it. But I mean, we can talk about the move away from like sort of correspondence thinking as just being part of much larger shifts that have, a lot of different aspects. It's not that, like the Reformation like causes this to happen, but it's, there's a lot of different sort of cultural forces, that lead to the birth of modern physics and all of that sort of stuff. So I don't think there's any kind of straightforward, simple answers there, and I'm certainly not an expert. So in talking a little bit about sort of how correspondence ends up getting picked up in some of the occult revivals, like in the 19th century. The idea of correspondence actually becomes quite popular in the 19th century, probably through the influence of Romanticism and other sort of traditions, especially in the kind of the art world and in poetry. Like the symbolist movement at the late 19th century in France, they use this idea of correspondences a lot. A lot of them are very influenced by Swedenborg, and so use it in a kind of Swedenborgian way, but it helps to sort of put these ideas sort of back into the culture after having been, more not entirely absent, but more invisible over the couple centuries, preceding that. So just as an example of this, this is from Baudelaire, his poem, the French 19th century poet, his poem Correspondences. So it's a short poem, so I'm just going to read the whole thing. He says, or he writes, "The pillars of nature's temple are alive and sometimes yield perplexing messages. Forests of symbols between us and the shrine remark our passage with accustomed eyes. Like long-held echoes, blending somewhere else into one deep and shadowy unison, as limitless as darkness and as day, the sounds, the scents, the colors correspond. There are odors succulent as young flesh, sweet as flutes, and as green as any grass, while others, rich, corrupt, and masterful, possess the power of such infinite things as incense, amber, Benjamin, and musk, to praise the senses' raptures and the mind's." So, and it's just a kind of example of the way this is getting picked up by a sort of art and poetry at this time. There's also kind of people get really interested in the idea of synesthesia, the associating of different sensory impressions with especially things like colors and sounds, or we're sort of associating back and forth between those things. Many people with synesthesia also associate letters with particular sensory impressions as well. So that idea becomes sort of fashionable in this cultural milieu. Let's see, a couple other things here. The Theosophical Society, they, of course, revive some of these ideas as well and talk about them. One particularly important thing is the work of C.W. Ledbetter and Annie Besant. They do some work, they've been publishing a book called Thought Forms on this, where they sort of clairvoyantly determine or sort of clairvoyantly understand different shapes and colors associated with different ideas or different feelings and sensations. So right here, this is the thought form of, this is the intention to know. And so they do a whole series of these, different types of thoughts and ideas, and then use some sort of a kind of scrying or clairvoyant procedure for deriving the form of that thing. And they also do it with colors in particular. So here you can see some of their color correspondences and the key to the meaning of colors. So you can see, you got the colors there at the top, and then underneath, you think like adaptability, simpleness, selfishness, avarice, jealousy, these things being associated with colors. A lot of this idea also forms that basis of the idea of being able to read people's auras, and the color of their aura indicating something about them. That's all sort of coming out of theosophy. But as we'll see, this sort of influences the Golden Dawn and some of their correspondences. One last thing here before we sort of rewind a little bit and talk about Hebrew more specifically, is that in the late 19th century, late 18th century in France, you have a growing esoteric interpretation of the tarot. Becomes more and more popular. I won't sort of go into all the details of the history there, but people, they start to talk about this idea that the tarot is actually an ancient and secret book. Now we know that all historical evidence points to it being really developed out of a card game, which has its own sort of interesting history going back at least into probably about 13th, 14th century Italy. It gets used as a divination system, though the specifics of it vary. There's a lot of different versions of the tarot deck with different numbers of cards, different cards. Eventually, the deck that ends up getting used it becomes the most popular and is the basis for the Golden Dawn and Crowley's deck is the Tarot de Marseille, which becomes the main or the deck that a lot of these esoteric interpretations of the tarot are built off of. And so one of these, there's a lot of different esoteric ideas about where the tarot came from. They talk about it being propagated by the gypsies, having come from all different ancient cultures. But Egypt is one of the really big ones here, and they actually identify the tarot with this mythical idea of the Book of Thoth, this ancient Egyptian text, containing all wisdom. This is that idea of the Book of Thoth is identified with the Tarot. Okay, so we're going to rewind a little bit here and talk about the Hebrew alphabet. So here you got the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. The exact spellings of the different letter names are going to vary a lot between sources. That's just something you sort of have to get used to. So the Hebrew alphabet derives from the Phoenician alphabet, which itself is derived from Egyptian hieroglyphics. So you can see here, I stole this image from Kieran Barry's book, The Greek Kabbalah. You can see on the left here, well, not the far left, but this column here, this is like the early Phoenician alphabet. And then you can see it going through a series of developments into Aramaic before finally arriving at the Hebrew alphabet that we know today. And so the things that are usually given as the meanings of the Hebrew letters, like this is Aleph means ox, Beth means house. I'm sure most of you are familiar with that idea. Those meanings actually come from the hieroglyphs that were the basis for the Phoenician alphabet. So like the Hebrew letter Aleph is originally derived from the hieroglyph for ox. And so on. So the letters as words sometimes have other meanings as well, but those are common meanings. And we'll talk about those meanings in more detail as we go through the letters more specifically. But it's just interesting to know that that's where they come from, is from Phoenician and from the hieroglyphs that they're derived from. Okay, so like I was saying about the Greeks start using their alphabet to represent the numerical values on the same model. People start using Hebrew speakers start doing the same thing. The Hebrew alphabet is 22 letters, and you need 27 in order to be able to do this well. Sometimes they don't use the final forms. You can just sort of double up on letters, but it's sort of clumsy. But what they do to get value, so Tav is the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It has a value of 400 here. And so to get the values of 500 through 900, there are 5 letters that have final forms. This is just sort of forms of the letters that are, the letters written differently when it's the last letter in a word. And so they use the 5 final forms to give the values of 500 through 900. Though, like I said, that does vary, and you'll see, like in the enumerations of words, like in Crowley and others, sometimes the final values are used, and sometimes they aren't. And it's as far as I know, it's the same way in the Hebrew tradition. Sometimes the final values are used, and sometimes they're not. But in writing the numbers, they're used because it lets you do it with less symbols and in a less confusing way. Okay, so I mentioned the Sefer Yetzirah. It's what esoteric Hebrew text that presents. We'll talk about this in a lot more detail in some of the coming weeks. For now, let's see what's important. It divides the Hebrew alphabet up into 3 groups: the 3 mother letters, which it attributes to the elements of fire, water, and air; the 7 double letters that it attributes to the 7 planets, and did I say 7 double letters? Yeah. And then the 12 single letters, which it attributes to the signs of the zodiac. Now, there's not really any variation. Aleph, Mem, and Shin get attributed to air, water, and fire. That's quite straightforward. Mem, actually, the old sort of hieroglyphic meaning of it, coming through Phoenician, all that, and retaining the meaning in Hebrew, is water. And so it's quite obvious that that's going to be associated with the element of water. Aleph is the breath sound, so that very naturally gets associated with air, and then Shin becomes fire. Now, the other correspondences, there is some controversy over. The one that's a little bit simpler is the zodiac sign. So the 12, first of all, the division of the alphabet into mother letters, single letters, and double letters is probably somewhat artificial and may have been created by whatever tradition it was that led to the writing of the Sefer Yetzirah in order for these correspondences to work. Some of the double letters do really have two values. There's been some question about whether or not Resh ever really had two pronunciations, or whether there's a little bit of sort of shifting things around in a way that lets the correspondences work better. Anyways, the single letters, the 12 single letters associated with the zodiac, in different versions of the Sefer Yetzirah, these are always pretty much the same. In what some people think, at least, is the oldest versions of the Sefer Yetzirah, although it says that these letters, like the 12 single letters corresponding with the zodiac signs and the 7 double letters corresponding with the planets, it doesn't actually specify which one corresponds with which. So it's possible that, at least some people think, in the oldest versions of this, the specific correspondences aren't given. But then different traditions and different versions of the Sefer Yetzirah out there, they all pretty much agree on the 12 single letters being attributed to the signs of the zodiac, and they just do it in order. You just go from Aries, Taurus, Gemini, down through the zodiac, and the same thing with the 12 letters in alphabetical order. And yeah, like I said, that stays constant across the different traditions, and really stays constant until Crowley makes one change, which we will talk about. Now, the planets are when things get difficult. Different versions of the Sefer Yetzirah attribute the 7 double letters to the 7 planets in different ways. And so there's just sort of controversy about that. It is the most variable thing. Interestingly, I noticed that in the Greek Kabbalah, the way that the 7 vowels are attributed to the 7 planets, that seems to vary also more than some of the other letter correspondences vary. So I don't know what that means, but it's an interesting thing. What is worth saying is that in no known version of the Sefer Yetzirah are the planet to letter correspondences the same as what we're going to be using and what get used in the Golden Dawn tradition. That does not match any known version of the Sefer Yetzirah. Though, again, there are some early versions of Sefer Yetzirah that it's at least consistent with because they're not specifying planetary correspondences. Again, we'll talk a lot more about the Sefer Yetzirah, especially in the next coming 3 weeks, because the Sefer Yetzirah breaks it down into these 3 categories of mothers, doubles, and singles, and the next 3 weeks we'll sort of break it down in the same way, and we'll actually read from some passages from the Sefer Yetzirah and talk about them. Okay, so another important thing here is Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa again. In his 3 books of occult philosophy, he associates the 10 Sephiroth with the planets. Oh, another important thing to know about like the Sefer Yetzirah and even the Sephiroth, the Sephiroth and the paths. These things exist. Well, I mean, there could be oral traditions that we don't know about, of course, but it seems that these things exist before the diagram known as the Tree of Life exists, and there are a lot of different versions of the Tree of Life diagram. But yeah, it's not always that. Sometimes I think we maybe put the Tree of Life as more at the center of this than historically or even practically it needs to be. So in Agrippa, he's talking about the 10 Sephiroth, and he associates the Sephiroth with the planets. And so Agrippa is still working within a geocentric cosmology. Here's sort of an illustration of some idea of the way that the world looked in a geocentric worldview. You've got the Earth at the center, and it's surrounded by a series of spheres. And you can see the way that this sort of represents the spheres. There, you've got the zodiac there, the spheres of the planets. And that image is a little bit complicated, so I'll show a kind of simplified one here. So here in this image, you've got earth and water in the center, and then air and fire. So this is the kind of elemental realm. And then above that, we've got the sphere of the moon, and then the sphere of Mercury, and then the sphere of Venus, then the sphere of the sun, then of Mars, then of Jupiter, then of Saturn. Then here we've got the sphere of the fixed stars, and then they're sort of differentiating a few different levels of the divine world beyond that, but that detail isn't particularly important here. but anyways, what Agrippa does is attributes the 10 Sephiroth to this sort of map, so that the lowest Sephirah, Malkuth, corresponds with the world and the elemental world, and then the Sephirah sort of in ascending order corresponds. So the 9th Sephirah Yesod corresponds with the moon, the 8th Sephirah Hod corresponds with Mercury, and so on until the 3rd Sephirah, Binah, corresponds with Saturn. Then the 2nd Sephirah, Hokmah, corresponds with the sphere of the fixed stars. And then the first Sephirah, Kether, the crown, the divine one, corresponds with what sort of in the Aristotelian kind of cosmology is called the primum mobile, the first mover. This is the idea of kind of the something like the divine. Aristotle's God is kind of a very abstract and distant sort of God. But anyways, the idea of the sphere of God being beyond the sphere of the fixed stars and that which gives motion to the others. Okay. Let's see. So now we're going to talk about a little bit about some trees of life. This image here is from one version of the Orchard of Pomegranates by Moshe Cordovero, the important Kabbalist. And so you can see this is quite similar to the tree of life that a lot of us are probably familiar with. There is a missing path here, and I don't know exactly what the story is. I don't know if that's just like an error in the illustration or what, but there is a path missing there. It's really cool. I don't know how well you can see it, but the in each Sephirah here, you've got a disc here with divine names printed on it that actually would have been attached in a way that they could have been rotated. And so in this version, a bunch of them have been torn off and are missing. But that's pretty cool. But on the model of Cordovero's tree of life, again, there are others. There's the Lurianic tree of life. There's the so-called Gra tree, other different ways of arranging the Sephiroth and the paths connecting them. So on the model of the Cordovero tree, the Jesuit 17th century scholar esotericist Athanasius Kircher comes up with his version of the tree here. And so you can see he's got the same basic path layouts. I don't know exactly, but well, it's not clear to me anyways that whether or not like Cordovero himself how he would have attributed the paths to the letters. So I'm not sure if it's the same as this. The later tradition that claims to sort of come from Cordovero, they attribute the paths, although they lay them out in the same way, they attribute the letters to the paths differently than Kircher does. So yeah, the exact history there isn't exactly clear to me. But you can see that in Kircher's model, this is Aleph here, this is Beth, this is Gimel. These are the letter to path attributions that the Golden Dawn and Crowley and the modern Hermetic tradition is using. One thing that is different in Kircher's tree is the way that he's associating the planets with the Sephiroth. So you can see that he's assigned the moon to Malkuth, he's assigned Mercury to Yesod, Venus to Hod, and so on. The Golden Dawn tradition doesn't pick up this part of the Kircher tree. Instead, they use the attributions of the planets to the Sephiroth in the way that Agrippa does it. Kircher doesn't follow Agrippa. But it is his path attributions that we're using. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit about the tarot attributions. So again, like I was saying in this early development of the esoteric interpretation of the tarot, the idea emerges that the 22 major arcana, the 22 trumps, should correspond with the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And this happens in a few different, at first it's just sort of mentioned that this is the case, but there's not like a specific set of attributions spelled out. And then eventually when Atea, Jean-Baptiste Aliette, who's an important early esoteric writer on the tarot, he does it in like a completely opposite order to the way that we do it, where he starts like Aleph corresponds with the last like trump, and then it sort of goes backwards. There's also some question about where the Fool should go. So if you've seen like Eliphas Levi's attributions, he starts. He does them in in order of the trumps and in alphabetical order, but he starts with trump number 1, the magician, and that gets attributed to Aleph, and then trump number 2, the Pepes or high priestess, that gets associated with Beth, and so on. And so you end up with a completely different version than the one that most of us are probably familiar with. Now, Crowley says that when Levi does this, that this is a blind, and that Levi knew the true attributions through an initiated tradition that he wasn't able to reveal. If you read Levi with that idea in mind, you can, I think, sometimes see that might be the case, though the jury is sort of out on that. Levi also, in the places where he's also sort of following the Sefer Yetzirah tradition about or one of the Sefer Yetzirah traditions about the way that the planets correspond with the 7 double letters, that doesn't match the way we do it. Okay, so this here is from, well, what you're looking at on the right is a page from the Cipher manuscript, and on the left is a sort of translation of it. You can see it's written in a cipher, and it's also a little messy and difficult to read. This is a scan from Darcy, the edition of the cipher manuscript, edited by Darcy Kuntz. Or, how do you say it? Yeah. Okay, so yeah, this is the cipher manuscript. If you're not familiar with it, is a set of documents written in a cipher of sort of unknown origin. There's sort of controversy about that, but they are the prime documents that are used in the building of the Golden Dawn initiatory system. Yeah, so Levi may have been involved with, I was just trying to think of how much I actually want to say. Yeah, David's pointing out the Leo Libra thing, and we will talk about that. I was just trying to think of how much I wanted to say about the sort of history and conjecture about the cipher manuscript. One author that a lot of sort of scholars tend to accept as the probable author of the cipher manuscript is a man named Kenneth Mackenzie. He was initiated of some Rosicrucian orders, and had also met with Eliphas Levi in Paris. And so, if you think that Levi was privy to like an initiated tradition of the correspondences, it's possible that Mackenzie sort of got that from Levi, or that they worked together to come up with a new set of attributions. It's not really clear exactly how it happens, but it's also not extremely important. So if you look on the left here, because the cipher itself is sort of difficult to look at, if you look on the left here, you'll see we've got the Hebrew alphabet here, and it's not arranged in alphabetical order. It's arranged with the 3 mothers of Aleph, Mem, and Shin first, then the 7 double letters of Beth, Gimel, Daleth, Kaf, Pei, Resh, and Tav, and then the 12 single letters after that. So within each group, they're in alphabetical order, but they're being broken out into that threefold classification. And so you can see that the 3 mother letters are being attributed to air, water, and fire, just as in the Sefer Yetzirah. And the 12 single letters, starting with Hey here, are being attributed to the 12 signs of the zodiac, just as in the Sefer Yetzirah. You can sort of ignore the tarot column there for a second, and then we'll come back to it. But the 12 double letters in order are attributed to the 12 signs of the zodiac. And now in the middle here, we can see the 7 double letters in alphabetical order, and then the planets attributed to them. I'm not aware of, and it seems to be that this is the first appearance of this particular attribution way of attributing the planets to the 7 double letters. And so because it also comes with tarot correspondence, and the correspondence of the planets and the tarot cards works very nicely, some have thought that this particular way of arranging the planets to the letters is actually sort of based, or is founded on the tarot, so that attributing the tarot cards in order to the Hebrew alphabet, you can then place the planets to the double letters based on their tarot cards. So the magician is very naturally for Mercury, the sun for the sun, and so on. Yeah, so that's an interesting thing to sort of think about, especially given how the attributions of the planets to the double letters is the thing that is so variable in the Sefer Yetzirah tradition. Yeah, so at least from one possible way of looking at it, or what one conjecture that we could make is that that the kind of at least within the Hermetic tradition, the sort of the solving of that problem and that difficulty, the tarot is used as the key to that. Now, again, historical claims for the tarot actually representing some, ancient, Hebrew or Egyptian knowledge are, of course, not historical. Though I think it's an interesting and powerful myth, but it obviously shows, I think, how integral, the tarot is to this. Okay, so I'm going to show you a couple more pages from the cipher manuscript here, just to give you a little bit of a taste of some of the tarot material that's here. There's really only a few pages about the tarot. So this is page 1 of the tarot lecture. So you're just looking at just the cipher here, and I'm going to read the English, translation of the cipher. So this is the tarot lecture, part 1. The 22 atus of Thoth. Tarot trumps equal Hebrew letters, Yetziratic paths. Learn now, O practicus of our ancient order, the true meaning. And then there's kind of the alpha omega with Cairo is a symbol that Levi uses to talk about the tarot. Let's see, where is that? You can. Anyways, I'll just keep it going. 30 and 2 are the paths, equal 22 letters, and the 10 sephiroth. The 10 sephiroth are the 10 numbered cards of each suit. The 4 suits are the 4 worlds. The 16 court cards are the 4-fold tetragrammaton. The 22 letters are the atus, or mansions of Thoth. This idea of the mansions of Thoth, this is actually part of Egyptian mythology. They're actually sort of like places in the underworld that knowledge of spells could sort of get you to in the afterlife. That they're obviously being totally reinterpreted here. But again, we see this connection to Thoth again, right? So these are the atus, or mansions of Thoth. The 22 letters are divided into 3 mothers, 7 doubles, 12 singles or simples, equals 3 elements, 7 planets, 12 zodiac signs. All right, and then the next page. So it is also with the 22 atus. Therein are the planets, elements, and the zodiac signs. For the book of Thoth is the universe, which is the veil of God. Learn then, O practicus, to know the universe and thyself. Seek in the manifest for the divine one, and when found, veil thy eyes in adoration. Behold the true attribution of tarot. Ponder it in thy heart. Reveal it not to the profane. These be the 22 atus. All right, and then on the next page after that, there's a few more, but this is as far as we'll go for right now. You see another layout similar to the other one that we looked at a minute ago, but we're now arranged in alphabetical order. So we can see the Hebrew letters in straight alphabetical order. Oh, actually, let me jump back. I'm going to jump back to here, and we can talk a little bit about the switch that's happening here. So, well, actually, it might be easier. Well, we might jump back and forth between the two. So again, here, this is alphabetical order. And so you can see that the trumps are being attributed more or less in order here to the letters. So it's just starting with Aleph as the Fool. The Fool being numbered 0 was something that's actually sort of added to the Marseille. Like in the Marseille deck, the Fool is not number 0. It's unnumbered. And some very traditional kind of Marseille people actually consider it to not be one of the major arcana, that there are 21 trumps, and the Fool is like a special wild card all on its own. But the renumbering of the Fool is an important sort of key to its attribution to the Hebrew alphabet in this way, so that Aleph corresponds with trump 0, and then Beth corresponds with trump 1, and so on. And then, just sort of going straight down through the trumps in order and the Hebrew letters in order. So again, now we're broken up into sort of mothers, doubles, and singles again. And so you can see what's happened here. You can see it's really sort of messy in the cipher manuscript, but what they've done neater on this side here is shown that the tarot attributions have been swapped. Now this says 13 equals strength there. I think that's actually just a sort of typo. If you look at the cipher, it kind of looks like it says 13, but it might say 8. 8 is actually the correct number. So there's either a misinterpretation or a sort of a manuscript error. That should really say 8 equals strength. And so you can see that the tarot trumps have been swapped in order. The zodiac signs have been left attributed to the letters, as they were in the Sefer Yetzirah, but the 11th and 8th Atus of the tarot have been swapped in their place, so that justice can correspond with Libra, and so that strength can correspond with Tef. I mean, it's a fairly obvious sort of thing that justice should correspond with Libra, and of course the traditional image in the strength card is a woman holding open the jaws of a lion, and Tef corresponds with Leo, which means lion, is the lion constellation. So it's that sort of switch is just a very natural sort of thing. If we look at this image here. Yeah, so you can see that here what's happened is that in putting the astrological signs in, we've gone in alphabetical order, but you'll see that the astrological signs come slightly out of order, so that we've got, so I'll back up here, right? So you've got Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, but then Libra, then Virgo, then we'll sort of skip over a planet here, then Leo, and then Scorpio would be next. So you can see that the two zodiac signs have swapped their place, but the Hebrew letters and the tarot trumps have been kept in order. You will sometimes see, I know this is true in like the Smith-Waite deck, that in order to sort of keep things better in order, or to make it seem a little bit neater, they'll actually reverse the numbering of the tarot trumps. Crowley followed in the Marseille and everything like that strength is 11 and justice is 8, and Crowley follows that as well. So we'll follow that as well. But it is something that you will sometimes see, like especially if you're looking at like the Smith-Waite deck or one inspired by it, you'll see the change in that numbering. Okay, so. Yeah, so that's kind of an intro there. That's where we get most of our correspondences. Let's see. I'll just sort of go through this in kind of more or less historical order here. So within the Golden Dawn, there is a book called the Book of Correspondences, mostly authored by Mathers. There's probably other contributions. This gets sort of passed around. The different correspondences and groups of correspondences are taught, throughout the course of the Golden Dawn, like initiatory system, though not organized in like a kind of single coherent way. It's like, it's often broken out in the same way that we saw in some of the earlier traditions, where you have like attributions to the planets and then a separate set of attributions to the Sephiroth and things like that, but they're not being like put together under a single kind of master system of correspondences, but are different groups of sort of interrelated things. They start to tabulate more of a kind of master key to all of this sort of stuff. So this Book of Correspondences is never published, but Crowley gets his hands on a copy of it and makes some changes, adds some things of his own, and then republishes this as 777. So 777 is, at least largely, seems to be the work of Mathers and probably some others, though Crowley does add some additional material to it. So I'm assuming here that most people are familiar with 777. Now the actual if you buy like the book 777, like this book here, which a lot of you are familiar with, it actually includes a bunch of other stuff too. There's an introductory essay by Rigardi, then an essay on gematria by Crowley. Then you have 777 proper, which is all the tables, that look like this. Yeah. This type of stuff. I should have included some images. I forgot to scan some of them. And then at the end, you've got the dictionary Sefer Sephiroth, which is like the dictionary of words and their values. But 777 itself is really just that middle section. Crowley publishes it in a sort of basic form. He later tries to republish some revised editions. So this doesn't happen until after his death, and I think it's Gerald York that finally issues 777 revised. And that's what's included in this book is the revised version of it that has some additional stuff and some revisions, as well as a lot of notes gathered from sort of marginalia and other unpublished notes of Crowley's that explain some of the rationale and concepts behind the correspondences. So I'm just take a second here to talk about what's included in 777 and what types of information we see. The Hebrew alphabet and the 32 paths are being used as the sort of key points here that everything's being associated to. So that's the 32 paths are the 10 Sephiroth plus the 22 letters. Here in this class, this series will be really focusing on the 22 letters, but you'll see like in 777, you'll see the numbers listed from 1 to 32. The 1 through 10 is the Sephiroth, and then the 11 through 32 is the letters and the 22 paths. Okay, yeah, so we see, again, the material that goes into 777 that was the Book of Correspondences and the Golden Dawn is drawn from a bunch of different places. A lot of it comes through Agrippa. 3 Books of Occult Philosophy was an important source for them. Obviously, there's material coming from the Sefer Yetzirah and lots of other documents and traditions as well. I don't know all the sources, but that's a lot of the core of it. So in there, you'll find some kind of basic Kabbalistic definitions, like the key scales, the Yetziratic attributions. The Yetziratic attributions are what we're mean by the sort of elemental, planetary, and zodiacal attributions. Others, Kabbalistic things like mystic numbers attributed to the different paths, paths of wisdom, secret names, parts of the soul. We also see a lot of hierarchies and names, a lot of these in Hebrew, both taken from the sort of Solomonic or the kind of spirit and conjuring traditions that are being attributed to the planets and zodiac signs and elements. And so we see lots of hierarchies, both of angels and of demonic spirits. And we see hierarchies attributed to the Sephiroth, to the planets, to the zodiac, to the elements, to the Kaliphoth. And also, you also see a lot attributed to the 36 decans. The decans are, you can divide each zodiac sign into 10-degree regions, and you get the entire zodiac divided into 36. And so you'll see a lot of hierarchies that correspond to the decans. We also see entire pantheons of deities from other traditions, Greek, Egyptian, he got Hindu gods in there, Northern European gods, a lot of different pantheons there. And again, this is going back to that idea of the Interpretatio Greca or Interpretatio Romana, the idea of the different pantheons corresponding to some sort of universal shared thing. A lot of those hierarchies that I was talking about, the hierarchies of names and angels, a lot of this is drawn from Kabbalistic works and from, both Hebrew, in Jewish magical texts, as well as sort of Solomonic and Goetic and other medieval kind of grimoire traditions that are using Hebrew names. One thing I maybe forgot to mention earlier, but by the time you get to someone like Agrippa, Hebrew, although it's of course it's not the it's the language that they're using. It's not the language that they're learning it, of course, as a way of looking into the history of their scripture. But it also has taken on this character of being like the language of creation, and so Hebrew, rather than Greek, or one way of thinking about why Hebrew, rather than Greek, is used as the core of like the magical language in the Hermetic Kabbalistic tradition, is this understanding coming through Hebrew mysticism and through like Jewish magical traditions. Into the grimoires of Hebrew as the language of creation, and that Hebrew letters and divine names formed from the Hebrew letters have a special magical power. The other things we see there are kind of what I was talking about, like theurgical correspondences, the correspondences of animals, plants, stones, different incenses and perfumes. Again, coming through those correspondences being largely to the planets and zodiac signs, but then all getting kind of tabulated together under the 22 paths and the Sephiroth. We also see other practical correspondences like magical weapons, magical powers. I think it's Crowley that adds the drugs corresponding to the different paths. Lots of other stuff too. We see sacred geometry, tarot, astrology, the color scales, which were derived by MacGregor Mathers and his wife. I'm not sure if her name is pronounced Moina Mathers or Mina Mathers. I've heard it said both ways. But they sort of clairvoyantly determine color scales for the different paths, and we'll talk about those. And you can obviously see the sort of resemblance to the way that the theosophy or theosophers were doing the same sorts of things. Oh, another thing I forgot to mention was that that book, the sort of thought forms and those theosophical ideas about the correspondences between these colors and these abstract shapes and different ideas, is actually extremely influential on the development of like abstract and modern art. The two sort of early, the first person probably to do abstract art was Hilma af Klint, or sort of fully modern abstract art, in the sense of modern art. It was Hilma af Klint, who was a student of theosophy herself, though her work, for a few different reasons, remained pretty unknown. Vasily Kandinsky, the Russian painter, he did it a few years after her, but he's one that often gets credit for it, and because his work became more widely known, is sort of more influential on the development of modern art. But he too is really influenced by this idea. So this idea of correspondence actually spills over into modern art, which is sort of interesting. But yeah, again, you can also see that influence in the Golden Dawn's tradition of color correspondences. What else? We had stuff from Enochian, from John Dee's work with the Enochian language being added into the correspondences in 777. Stuff from geomancy, from alchemy, different traditions of sacred anatomy. Both coming through astrology and from like Egyptian mythology. Also different alphabets are being brought in. So you'll see Greek and a few other alphabets, some different magical kind of cipher alphabets all being brought into 777, as well as some specific Golden Dawn stuff, like the Golden Dawn grades, passwords to the grades, and so on. So hopefully, that's like a lot of different stuff, but hopefully the sort of material that we talked about and the different ways that people over time have thought about correspondences helps to make sense out of what those things are, and how they all, they come from, they weren't all like conceived of as a single thing. The kind of natural correspondences are different than, correspondences with, letters and tarot cards is different than, the way that, the planetary powers corresponds with plants or gemstones. But in the Golden Dawn tradition, this stuff is all getting kind of synthesized together, even though it has sort of different sources, and we might understand different sets of correspondences to operate in different ways. Okay, sorry, we're running a little late on time here, but there was a lot to go through. So, if you need to take off, feel free to take off, but this probably will take another 15 minutes or so to get through. One thing I'll just say now, after this class, this is all sort of introductory sort of stuff. After this class, we'll really dive into working with the stuff directly. This is all just sort of preamble, essentially, for really jumping into it. Hopefully this gives a kind of theoretical background for being able to understand what we'll do afterwards. Let's see. So I'll mention, before going on to sort of Crowley's late work with the tarot, I was going to read from it. Maybe I won't. In Liber O is a really good example. Some of Crowley's basic instructions in ceremonial magic. Actually, I'll read just a little bit of it. He talks there about, at the beginning of this instruction, now this is an early AA instruction, so it's probably written somewhere between like 1906 and 1908, so fairly early on. And in it, he's really encouraging like skepticism about the existence of things like, he says, in this book it is spoken of the Sephiroth and the paths, of spirits and conjurations, of gods, spheres, planes, and many other things which may or may not exist. It is immaterial whether these things exist or not. By doing certain things, certain results will follow. Students are most earnestly warned against attributing objective reality or philosophical validity to any of them. So unlike in a lot of these earlier traditions, Crowley is quite skeptical about the nature of correspondences. And I think in a very modern sort of way would tend to see, the sort of language and the correspondences between, linguistic signs and symbols as something closer to a convention rather than a sort of natural truth. Though, again, what Crowley says changes at different times in his life and in different contexts and when he's writing for different purposes. The intention in Liber O is to be very practical and to be very skeptical. Let's see, and then he talks about the correspondences and the learning of the correspondences. He talks about first, sort of memorizing the basic correspondences. And then he says when these are committed to memory, the student will begin to see and understand the nature of these correspondences. He says, if we take an example, the use of the table will become clear. Let us suppose that you wish to obtain knowledge of some obscure science. In column 45, line 12, you will find knowledge of sciences. That column is sort of magical powers. By now, looking up line 12 in the other columns, you will find that the planet corresponding is Mercury, it's number 8, its lineal figure, the octagon and octagram, the god who rules the planet Thoth, or in Hebrew symbolism, Tetragrammaton Adonai, and Elohim Zabaoth, its archangel Raphael, its choir of angels B'nai Elohim, its intelligence Tiriel, its spirit Tepharthareth, its colors orange, for Mercury is the sphere of the Sephira Hod, 8, yellow, purple, gray, and indigo rayed with violet, its magical weapon, the wand or caduceus, its perfume, mastic, and others, its sacred plants, vervain and others, its jewel, the opal or agate, its sacred animal, the snake, etc. You would then prepare your place of working accordingly. In an orange circle, you would draw an 8-pointed star of yellow, at whose point you would place 8 lamps. The sigil of the spirit, which is to be found in Cornelius Agrippa and other books, you would draw on the 4 colors with such devices as your experience may suggest. And so on. We cannot here enter into length into all the necessary preparations. So you can see a little bit about the way that he's thinking about the usage of this thing for practical, ceremonial work. Oh yeah, good question, David. I'll come back to that. Yeah, good point. Let's see. So 2 things left here to cover before we arrive at our sort of final stage of these correspondences. And the first one here is the so-called Hay-Zadie switch. So when Crowley, let's see, I'm actually just going to quote from him here. And then I'll kind of explain as we go along. This is from Crowley's book, Book of Thoth, which is written quite late in his life. And we'll be referring to this book a lot throughout the series. But I specifically want to address this sort of change or correction, or however you want to think about it, that gets made to like the correspondences that you're looking at now. So he says, Frater Perdurabo, that's him, Crowley, had made a very profound study of the tarot since his initiation to the order on the 18th of November, 1898. For 3 months later, he had attained the grade of practicus. As such, he became entitled to know the secret attribution. He constantly studied this and the accompanying explanatory manuscripts. He checked up on all of these attributions to the numbers. He checked up on all these attributions of the numbers to the forms of nature and found nothing incongruous. But when, April 8th, 1904, he was writing down the Book of the Law from the dictation of the messenger of the secret chiefs, he seems to have put a mental question, suggested by the words in chapter 1, verse 57, the law of the fortress and the great mystery of the house of God. The house of God is one of the names of the Tower Trump numbered 16. That's more commonly known as the Tower. So the mental question that he poses is to this effect: have I got these attributions right? For there came an interpolated answer. All these old letters of my book are aright, but Zadie is not the star. This also is secret. My prophet shall reveal it to the wise. This was exceedingly annoying. If Zadie was not the star, what was, and what was Zadie? He tried for years to counterchange the card, the star, which is numbered 17, with some other. He had no success. It was many years later that the solution came to him. Zadie is the emperor, and therefore the positions of 17 and 4 must be counterchanged. This attribution is very satisfactory. He says, yes, but it is something a great deal more than satisfactory. It is, to clear thought, the most convincing evidence possible that the Book of the Law is a genuine message from the secret chiefs. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about this change and what it looks like and why he thinks that it's so symmetrical and compelling. Okay, so if we look at our attributions here, or actually I'm going to go back to this one here where they're arranged by their categories, you'll see that the very first of the double letters, that's He here, is being attributed to Atu 4, the emperor, and to Aries, and that the second to last here, Zadi, is being attributed to Atu 17, the star, and Aquarius. So, where this switch sort of happens here between the two tarot trumps kind of happens around Virgo. Or if we're thinking of it laid out in this way, where we've got the tarot trumps and Hebrew letters in order, what's happened is that Libra and let me not confuse myself here. Libra and Leo have sort of traded places around Virgo, which is in the middle of them. And so now we're going to have a switch between Zadi, which was attributed to Aquarius, and He, which was attributed to Aries. And so if we look at what this is it's a sort of a wheel, with the zodiac signs attributed to it, with two loops being drawn on either end. So let's see, coming from, we'll talk about the sort of golden dawn. So coming from Taurus to Gemini to Cancer. Now what's happened here is that we've gone sort of up to Leo, and then to Virgo, and then to Libra, and back around again. So it's like a kind of figure 8 twist has been put into the zodiac here. Hopefully that makes sense. And so what Crowley's talking about here is that there's now another symmetrical twist being made to the zodiac. Let's see. So coming from Scorpio, Sagittarius to Capricorn, we're now going to kind of loop down to Aquarius, and then we've got Pisces in the middle here, and then Aries, and then continuing on with Taurus. So there's now two symmetrical loops in the zodiac. So Crowley says that this happens in a perfectly symmetrical way. I'm not going to go to that quite yet. It doesn't exactly. If we go back to like this layout here, all that's been changed here is just how the tarot trumps correspond, but the attributions of the zodiac signs to the letters are the same as in the Sefer Yetzirah. But what Crowley is going to do here is actually change from the Sefer Yetzirah so that it's not just the star and the emperor that are going to change places, but Aquarius and Aries are going to change places as well. So it's actually it's a change of a somewhat different nature. I won't get too bogged down in that. So when you do this, what you end up with is this. So what I've taken here, I took the scan there from the cipher manuscript and just sort of cut the pieces out of them and rearranged them so that you can see that now the star, He, or that He corresponds with the star, which is Atu 17, and with Aquarius, and that Zadi corresponds with the emperor, which is Atu 4, and Aries. So again, although they seem like when you just sort of list them out like this, it seems like one from the top and one from the bottom. When we looked at just the double letters arranged around the zodiac, you can see that they're actually quite close to each other, just only separated by the sign Pisces in between them, and that the looping are sort of around Pisces sort of mirrors the looping around Virgo. So this now is our final set of attributions. We're not going to talk about for the rest of the series now. We're just going to sort of stick to these attributions. The exact names of the tarot cards will sort of change, like in Crowley's deck, and even in the Golden Dawn deck are different than what's listed here in the cipher manuscript. That's just sort of surface detail. But the main attributions here, this is what we'll be using. So hopefully some of that was helpful. for getting a sense of where this comes from, and also starting to work out some of the internal logic of it. If you just sort of look at a chart like this or something like that, it seems very chaotic and random, but I think, or seems sort of confused or something like that maybe, or is just confusing. But hopefully looking at some of the history helps make more sense out of that. And then also all the different types of correspondences, hopefully that sort of helps make sense of how all this different stuff ends up getting put together into these sort of confusing but arcane looking tables. Okay, so I just want to, and we're running a little bit late, but I just wanted to address a couple of things about the kind of attitude towards these correspondences. So, quote from Crowley here. This is from Book of Thoth again. Again, this is a very late book too. So where, like Liber O is a very early one. This is much later in his life, and I think you can notice the difference in his attitude here. So he says, unimportant to the present purpose are tradition and authority. This is talking about the different traditions of saying, oh, our Tower attributions or our Yetziratic attributions are actually part of an older initiated lineage and things like that. He's kind of dismissing all of those claims. This is unimportant to the present purpose are tradition and authority. Einstein's theory of relativity does not rest on the fact that when his theory was put to test, it was confirmed. The only theory of ultimate interest about the tarot is that it is an admirable symbolic picture of the universe based on the data of the Holy Kabbalah. And I'm going to skip down a little bit. And he says, complete mystery surrounds the question of the origin of this system. Any theory which satisfies the facts demands assumptions which are completely absurd. To explain it at all, one has to postulate in the obscure past a fantastic assembly of learned rabbins who solemnly calculated all sorts of combinations of letters and numbers and created the Hebrew language on this series of manipulations. This theory is plainly contrary, not only to common sense, but to the facts of history, and to all we know about the formation of language. Nevertheless, the evidence is equally strong that there is something, not a little of something, but a great deal of something, a something which excludes all reasonable theories of coincidence in the correspondence between words and numbers. It is an undeniable fact that any given number is not merely one more than the previous number and one less than the subsequent number, but is an independent individual idea, a thing in itself, a spiritual, moral, and intellectual substance, not only as much as, but a great deal more than, any human being. Its merely mathematical relations are indeed the laws of its being, but they do not constitute the number any more than the chemical and physical laws of reaction and the human anatomy give a complete picture of man. So I think this is a really interesting way that he's being modern, in the sense of being sort of skeptical about, talking about the actual, like what we actually know about the development of languages, about, anthropological and historical information, but also saying that, when you look into this thing deeply, it's clear that it's not just a coincidence, that this isn't just a set of things that could have been done in any old way and it doesn't really matter. There is a mystery here, in a genuine mystery. Okay, yeah, so I'll just make a couple of comments before we wrap up here. David had the good question there where he says, let's see, how did he actually phrase it? So he said, can you speak to how this knowledge, when meditated on and internalized, becomes a living sword in the magician's hand? That sounds like Crowley. I don't recognize that quote, but that sort of totally could be. So the way I think that this sort of habit, meditation, of course, is a big one. Meditation on the symbols, meditation on the tarot trumps. But I think also the understanding that this is a language. It's not just that example that Crowley gives from Liber O about, you want to do a Mercury ritual, so you look up like, okay, this is the color, this is the number, this is the incense. There's something very rote and mechanical about that. But I think, and it also looks at these things as if like we're just sort of chopping up the universe into like 32 boxes or 22 boxes. But I think if we think of these things more like a language and more like different sort of overlapping relationships between, both between symbols, between, things from the celestial world, the material world, things from our own psychology, different esoteric symbols. We see these things as sort of networks of relationships. And that this is a language that is something that is you learn to speak and you learn to use it by doing it. It's not just about sort of chopping things up and filing them away into 32 categories. Crowley talks about the Kabbalah at one point as a filing cabinet, that you've just got these sort of more or less arbitrary set of categories, and you just start like attributing everything to them. There is something to that, and of course there's a nice like pragmatic sort of approach to it. You're not saying, oh, this is the ancient secret wisdom, or something like that. You're just saying this is a really useful tool. But I think that, again, thinking of it rather than as being like a filing cabinet, that everything is just sort of put into neat little boxes, but being something more like webs of interrelation. As we saw at the beginning, Thoth is generally attributed to Hermes and to Mercury, and so is associated with the planet Mercury. But he also has this lunar association, through the Egyptian tradition and with the calendar. And so you might say, well, okay, but so which box do we put Thoth in then? Like, does he go in the Mercury box? Does he go in the Moon box? Does he sort of go in both? Like, what's going on? And I think instead, if we think about these things as connections, Mercury has, or Thoth has the connections to Hermes and to the planet Mercury, and he also has connections to the Moon, and that those connections and those sympathies are the language, and it's not about splitting them up and putting them in little boxes. So what you see in 777, in tables of correspondence, that's like a really bare bones, it's a real skeleton for like the living system, which is always going to be more complex and multi-layered. There's going to be variants in different traditions. There's going to be things that sort of fit in multiple places, or especially when we're talking about things like the tarot trumps or different gods. The deities of different traditions, those things are always going to be bigger than any little category. Especially someone like Thoth, we saw that in his although he's often just the scribe or messenger of the gods, like in his cult center, he's worshipped as the creator. So there's a way that you can take any symbol and kind of elevate it to a complete and total symbol, or as a symbol of the absolute, and that. This way that you can sort of reconfigure the things and arrange them in different ways, I think is a lot of the power of it. In that, again, it's a language. It's not necessarily a doctrine or something in itself, but it's a set of symbols and interrelationships between symbols and between things and ideas that allow you to speak and to say different things using them. Yeah, so I think I'll just sort of leave it there. I'm going to pick up this, some kind of general comments about how to approach and how to think about these types of symbols at the beginning of our next class. But anyways, yeah, so that was a lot of information there. But yeah, I hope that was interesting. I'm happy to hang out for a couple more minutes if people do have questions. I know that was already quite long. But yeah, next week we'll dive into it, and we'll talk for about an hour and a half again about the 3 mother letters. And then the week after, we'll talk about the double letters and the planets. We'll also talk about the elements too. The elements and the mother letters have a kind of complicated relationship because there's 4 or 5 elements and only 3 mother letters. So we'll get into all that stuff next time. Then we'll talk about the double letters and the planets, then the single letters and the zodiac signs. And then we'll just in alphabetical order, walk through the whole alphabet and look at a lot of the tarot trumps and build up a lot of these correspondences. It won't be there's a lot of stuff in the Crowley correspondences that I won't go through. I'll try to pick what seems to me the most useful and the most core. A lot of that very, sort of demonic hierarchies of, like the decans or something like that is maybe useful if you're doing some very specialized work, but I'm not going to present it here. And likewise, some of the stuff coming in from other traditions, I will largely leave out. There's a lot of Crowley does attributions of things from like Indian, both Hindu and Buddhist traditions, from Chinese, like Taoist traditions, stuff taken from the Arabic traditions. It's a kind of exercise in, what we call like the perennial philosophy, the idea that there's a wisdom tradition underlying all the various traditions. But I don't know that they're incredibly useful. They're, again, it's something a little bit more like a kind of academic exercise. So I'll largely not get into that stuff too. But yeah. Let's see, a few questions maybe coming in here. Let's see, Lana, myself, I'm putting the video and slides in the discussion forum. Yeah, the video will definitely go up. It might be a little while before the slides go up. We're sort of reconfiguring the way that, or rearranging the way that or where those things get hosted and stuff like that. So we'll figure it out, but at least the video will be up very soon. And if anyone wants to email me, I can send you the slides too. Oh, right, and as I always sort of say at the end of these classes, for more info about Temple of the Silver Star, you can visit our website at tots.org or write to info@tots.org. Here's my email address if you want to contact me directly. For non-members, that's people who aren't members of the academic or initiatory track, there's also a $5 suggested donation, and you can send that via PayPal to payments@tots.org. Again, that's just a suggested donation to support the nonprofit work of the order. Let's see, a couple other questions coming in here. See, Chaz says, I know it's complicated to go into, but do you personally think Crowley's Star Emperor switch does add a symmetrical loop? I've tried following it so many times, and while it does add one symmetry, it destroys another, and I can't find a way to rectify this. Yeah, I mean, there is a symmetry to it. If you look at it like in this way here, I mean, that's obviously quite a symmetrical image. But again, exactly as you say, there is another symmetry that's no longer there. Yeah, I mean, Crowley certainly found it compelling, and it seemed that way to him. But yeah, I mean, it's a symmetry of a sort. A lot of I was talking about this with someone recently. A lot of the symmetries of the Kabbalah and like in the Tree of Life can be kind of messy or non-obvious or almost happen in a way it's like an asymmetrical symmetry or something like that. It's a very complex and multi-layered thing. You're never going to find sort of easy, simple things. Stuff always happens in this way that sort of really walks a fine line between seeming like necessity and seeming more like sort of chance or being arbitrary. There's always a funny sort of ambiguity there. Yeah. But I think as you sort of learn to sort of work, especially kind of treating them in a sort of looser, kind of not looser, but in a more like flexible and reconfigurable sort of way, I think some of the symmetries become more clear when you drop like wanting, every time there's a water sign on the left to be a water symbol on the right, and some sort of very perfect, simple, immediately apprehensible sort of symmetries. I think that there are deeper symmetries within it. Yeah, definitely. There's a comment here about how a way to flex one's brain, leading to improved mental acuity. I'd sort of left that out, but I think if you're familiar with the idea of like the memory palaces, like that were used in the Renaissance, especially Giordano Bruno, who actually used memory palaces as a magical tool. I think that the Kabbalah can really be thought of as a memory palace. So useful, for the training of the mind and for developing the memory. But also, again, I think it presents a more magical way of looking at it than just a filing cabinet. But it's a kind of like internal map where you can sort of walk through your internal tree of life, walk through your correspondences. And associate powerful images and sensory data and all kinds of symbols and things like that. And you can really build up this kind of internal, like not just map, but also almost like ecosystem of symbols inside of yourself. And I think there's something extremely magical about that, and about being able to think in that type of way through symbol and association and relation. Yeah, I think that really sort of changes your mind in a very magical way. So yeah, thanks everybody. I know that we're going close to 2 hours now, but I'm glad we got through all that. And yeah, and like I said, next time we'll be jump much more into to the specifics of it. If anyone here is totally new to this sort of stuff, familiarizing yourself with the Hebrew alphabet, like being able to just sort of recognize the letters and the names of the letters, that might be really helpful. Again, we'll go through this in more detail. I didn't expect anyone, who's not familiar with this stuff already to sort of immediately memorize it all or pick that up. So we will go through it, but if you're not super familiar with the Hebrew alphabet, that might be a good idea before next class. So yeah, thanks everybody, 93s, and I'll see you at the same time next Sunday, where we'll jump into the mother letters. All right, have a great day and stay healthy out there.